Welcome to the Umbra Vortex, where whispers begin and screams never end. Beyond this point, only madness awaits. This isn't a place for comfort, only for truth. Not the kind found in books or muttered in confession, but a raw, unfiltered reality, cloaked in shadow, stitched with dread, and pulsing just beneath the skin of sanity. I'm Edward J. Hallow, and I'll be the last voice you hear before the silence consumes you. Tonight, you'll hear a tale of expectations and the danger of assuming too much. A story where a simple conversation opens the door to an unsettling truth. A woman, a window, and a story that isn't quite what it seems. This is the story of the open window, where the line between reality and a well-spun tale is as thin as a breeze. The carriage wheels groaned as they rolled through the mire of the country road, the axles shrieking under the weight of time and distance. Frampton Nuttall sat rigidly inside, his gloved hands clenched tight around the knob of his walking stick. The countryside that surrounded him was pale and bleak, rolling moorland covered in a mist that did not rise, but clung, like breath on a corpse. The afternoon light was dwindling, and what remained of it was filtered through a dull, pewter sky. He had come here to recover, to restore his shattered nerves with quiet air and pastoral stillness. That was the advice, anyway, dispensed by a city doctor who had not looked him in the eye, but scribbled quickly and with finality. The countryside, they said, would calm his nerves. Distance, solitude, and silence. And yet, everything about this place made Frampton feel more unsettled. There was a kind of silence here that was unnatural, as though the land itself were holding its breath. The carriage came to a lurching stop in front of an old, ivy-clad house, isolated at the far end of the heath. Its high gables loomed like watchful shoulders against the sky, and its windows were tall and narrow, like slits in a fortress wall. Some of them glowed faintly with yellow light, flickering behind thick drapes. The rest were blank and dark, mirroring the grey sky with an indifferent gaze. Frampton stepped down and rapped at the heavy front door, his heart thudding harder than he liked to admit. He was not fond of strangers. He was not fond of long silences. He was not fond of country isolation. And yet, here he was. The door opened without a sound. A girl stood before him. She looked to be about 15, though her face carried a stillness beyond her years. She was dressed in a long, dark gown that looked more suited to mourning than hospitality. Her hair was pinned up in a severe style, and her eyes, deep, dark, and strangely unwavering, rested on him with neither interest nor alarm. "You must be Mr. Nuttall," she said, her voice quiet and cool, like a shadow falling across a page. "My aunt will be down presently. She often rests in the afternoon." Frampton bowed slightly, removing his hat. "Yes, your aunt was kind enough to agree to receive me. My sister, she visited here some years ago." The girl turned and began to lead him down a long corridor. The hallway smelled faintly of lavender and something older, something musty, like closed trunks, old paper, and dried flowers. Oil paintings hung on the walls, stiff, grim ancestors in high collars and lace, staring down at him with blurred, fading faces. They entered the drawing room, and immediately Frampton was struck by the gloom. Heavy curtains were drawn across most of the windows, except one. A tall French window at the far end of the room stood open, revealing the lawn beyond. The curtains that framed it were a dark, faded green, and they stirred faintly with each gust of cold wind that breathed through the gap. He glanced at the open window and frowned. "It seems late in the season for that to be open." The girl followed his gaze, then sat gracefully on a worn chaise near the hearth, where a small fire struggled to give warmth. "It is always kept open," she said, with a quiet finality. Frampton tilted his head, uneasy. She folded her hands in her lap and looked straight at him. 3 years ago today, my aunt's husband and her 2 brothers went out that very window," she said, her voice low, "to go shooting across the moor. It was just like this. A grey afternoon, wind rising, mist thickening. They took their guns, their dog, an old brown spaniel, and walked off into the distance." Frampton blinked, suddenly alert. "They never returned," she went on. "There's a bog that lies just beyond the thicket. It doesn't look like much, but it swallows what it wants. Their bodies were never recovered." Frampton stiffened. How dreadful. The girl's eyes didn't waver. "My aunt was never quite the same. She insists they will return, just as they left, without a day aged. She keeps the window open for them, every day at twilight. She says they might come back confused, and the window will guide them in." There was a silence. Frampton's gaze was fixed now on the open window, the way the wind passed through it with such intention, brushing the rug, stirring the edges of the long drapes like fingers. "I sometimes think I see them," the girl whispered, her eyes distant. "Out there in the mist, the dog bounding ahead, their boots dragging. The same tired voices." Frampton opened his mouth to speak, but said nothing. A faint chill had touched his spine. Before he could respond, footsteps descended from the floor above, measured, deliberate, and echoing faintly in the high-ceilinged halls. Mrs. Sappleton entered the room. She was a tall woman in late middle age, dressed in elegant, if outdated, black lace. Her features were sharp, her complexion pale, and her expression cheerful, but curiously absent, as if part of her mind were always listening for something else. "I'm so sorry to have kept you waiting," she said, glancing at the girl, then to Frampton. "I hope Vera has been keeping you company." "She has been. Most enlightening," Frampton murmured. Mrs. Sappleton smiled vaguely and gestured toward the open window. "I do hope they haven't gotten caught in the mud again. They're dreadfully careless about the bog, always trudging back in, all over the carpet, with that dog dripping everywhere." Frampton stared at her. You expect them soon?" "Any moment now," she said, with bright certainty. "I left it open for them, of course. I always do." She began chatting about shooting parties and the game they were likely to bring back, but Frampton barely heard her. His mind was spinning. The woman was not grieving. She was delusional. She believed the dead could return. The clock on the mantel chimed 6, a long, cold chime. Outside, the mist had thickened into a wet silver curtain. He caught Vera watching the window again, her hands gripped tightly in her lap. And then, just as the clock's final chime faded, something moved on the lawn. 3 figures, dark and heavy-limbed, emerged from the mist. They were walking slowly, guns over their shoulders. A brown dog trotted ahead, wagging its tail. Frampton's breath stopped in his chest. His mouth opened in a silent gasp. The figures were too far to make out clearly, but there was no mistaking their shape. The gait, the posture. It was them. The dead had returned. A moan caught in his throat. He bolted from the chair, stumbled toward the door, and fled down the hallway. His footsteps pounded against the tile. A hat stand crashed as he shouldered past it. He tore open the front door, flinging himself into the evening gloom with a strangled cry, his coat flapping like a shroud behind him. From the drawing room, voices floated calmly. "Who was that lunatic who dashed past me just now?" asked one of the men, as he stepped in through the window, laying down his gun. Mud caked his boots. The dog nosed at the hearth. Mrs. Sappleton sighed and rose from her chair. Some gentleman my sister met in town. Poor fellow. Ran off like he'd seen something awful. Probably the dog, said Vera smoothly, rising and closing the window. They looked at her. He told me, she said, very seriously, that once while in India he was chased into a graveyard by a pack of wild dogs and had to spend the night in a newly dug grave to survive. Quite the trauma. She walked to the fire and stirred the coals gently, her face calm, her voice steady. Vera specialized, as her family often said, in romance at short notice. A well-told lie can travel farther than the truth, especially when dressed in grief. And sometimes the scariest thing isn't what walks through the window, but what we believe might. This was the open window, a tale of nerves, deception, and the thin veil between reality and imagination. I'm Edward J. Hallow, and if someone offers you a window into their soul tonight, look twice, because not every story is meant to be trusted. The wind may whisper, but it doesn't always tell the truth.